The first time I felt it, it was just a flicker, something small and easily dismissed. Sarah had been leaving for her weekend trips for months now, and I'd never questioned them. But last Friday, as she rushed to pack her suitcase, I noticed her hesitating over a black dress that looked more suited for a gala than a business mixer. "That's new," I remarked, trying to sound casual, though my voice wavered ever so slightly. "Oh, it's just for an after-dinner event," she replied breezily, but her fingers lingered on the fabric for a moment too long. Her hand trembled slightly as she folded it away, and my chest tightened. It was a harmless enough moment, but it stuck with me like a splinter I couldn't ignore. That night, I sat in the darkened living room, staring blankly at the TV as her words replayed in my mind. My tea sat untouched in my hands, the warmth long gone. Why hadn't she mentioned this event before? Why was she packing perfume she hadn't worn in years, the one she always called her special occasion scent? My rational side whispered that I was being paranoid, but the growing weight in my gut said otherwise. Sarah was a good wife, wasn't she? Ambitious, driven. She loved me. If she was being secretive, it had to be because she was planning something special, maybe a surprise, like a promotion. I clung to that thought, desperately. But the cracks grew wider. The next morning, as she kissed me goodbye, something felt off. Her smile was there, but it didn't reach her eyes. Her hug felt perfunctory, mechanical. As her car disappeared down the street, I found myself standing in our bedroom, my heart pounding for no reason I could name. Her side of the closet looked like a boutique had exploded, carefully chosen outfits, elegant shoes she rarely wore at home. My gaze fell on an empty space where her travel bag usually rested. Something about it felt ominous, though I couldn't explain why. Then I saw her GPS. I wasn't snooping, at least that's what I told myself. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand, and I reached to silence it. When I picked it up, the navigation app was still open. The address wasn't for a downtown hotel or a conference center. Instead, it led to a marina hours from where she claimed to be staying. My chest tightened, the room spinning slightly. What was she doing there? It could have been work-related, but why wouldn't she tell me? My throat dried as I stared at the screen. The address burned into my memory. I told myself to put the phone down, but my hands wouldn't stop trembling. By Sunday night, the unease had become a gnawing anxiety. Sarah came home flushed, her cheeks glowing, her eyes bright. But there was something new on her wrist, a bracelet I had never seen before, glittering under the kitchen light. "Client gift," she said casually when I asked. I nodded, trying to match her nonchalance, but my gut screamed otherwise. Over the next week, my mind wouldn't let go of the marina. The address haunted me, demanding answers. Every night, as I lay in bed beside her, the questions grew louder. Who is she meeting? What is she hiding? The breaking point came on a quiet Thursday evening. Sarah was in the shower when her phone buzzed again. This time, I didn't hesitate. My hands shook as I unlocked it, my breath shallow and ragged. The text thread with an unsaved number was brief, but devastating. "Him, can't wait to see you again this weekend. I've booked the terrace, your favorite view. Sarah, you're too good to me." Counting down the minutes. My blood turned to ice, my chest tightening like a vice. There were no names, no explicit confessions, but the tone was unmistakable. When she stepped out of the shower, toweling her hair, I was already back on the couch, staring blankly at the television. "You okay?" she asked, her voice cheerful, oblivious. "Yeah," I said, forcing a smile that felt like a mask. "Just tired." I couldn't confront her, not yet, not without more proof. But something inside me had shifted. I wasn't the trusting husband who believed every word she said anymore. By the time Saturday rolled around, I was ready. I waited until she left, then grabbed my keys and followed her. As I trailed her car down the coastal highway, my mind was a storm of emotions. Rage, heartbreak, dread. The GPS address burned in my thoughts, a destination I couldn't avoid. She parked at the marina, stepped out of the car, and walked toward a sleek motorboat waiting at the dock. I stayed hidden, watching as she greeted the boat operator with a wide, dazzling smile. My stomach twisted as she boarded the boat, her carefree laugh ringing out as they sped off toward a private island. I didn't move. I couldn't. My heart hammered in my chest, my breath shallow and uneven. She wasn't worried about being caught. She thought I'd never know, but I did. The marina owner hesitated when I asked to rent a skiff, but my desperation must have convinced him. As the engine roared to life, I gripped the wheel tightly, the salty wind biting at my face. I wasn't sure what I'd find on that island, but I knew one thing for certain. There was no turning back now. The first wave of realization felt like a punch to the gut, sharp and hollowing. As I steered the rented skiff over choppy waters toward the distant outline of the island resort, the text message replayed in my mind like a cruel mantra, counting down the minutes. The simplicity of it cut deeper than any elaborate confession ever could. It wasn't just the words, it was the ease, the intimacy they carried. And that heart emoji at the end? It felt like a taunt, a mocking flourish from a woman who had nothing to hide. My hands gripped the wheel tighter, knuckles whitening. The rough texture of the wheel bit into my skin, grounding me, but my mind raced in 1,000 directions. What did I expect to find out here? Proof? Closure? Or was this just some self-inflicted punishment, an exercise in masochism? Doubt gnawed at the edges of my resolve, whispering seductively in the back of my mind. Maybe you're wrong. Maybe there's an explanation. Maybe this isn't what it seems. But then the image of her smile at the dock rose unbidden, vivid and damning, and I nearly growled aloud. That wasn't the smile of a woman rushing to a business conference. That was the smile of someone running to him. The waters grew calmer as I approached the resort's private docks, the scene straight out of a luxury travel magazine. Pristine white sands shimmered under the late afternoon sun, flanked by elegant palm trees swaying lazily in the breeze. The horizon was dotted with yachts that looked like floating palaces. It was beautiful and entirely alien to the life I thought we shared. I cut the engine and let the skiff drift closer, keeping out of sight. Through the binoculars I'd borrowed from the marina, I scanned the beachfront. My heart slammed against my ribs when my gaze settled on the terrace of the resort's restaurant. There she was. She sat across from him, a man I'd never seen before but already hated with every fiber of my being. His hand rested casually on the table between them, so close to hers it made my stomach churn. They were laughing, their faces lit with a warmth and intimacy that twisted the knife lodged in my chest. It wasn't just her body language, it was the way she looked at him. Soft, open, vulnerable. The way she used to look at me. I lowered the binoculars, bile rising in my throat. My fingers gripped the edge of the skiff so tightly I thought the wood might splinter. This wasn't networking, wasn't some innocent misunderstanding. This was betrayal, laid bare under the golden rays of a tropical sunset. For a moment, I was paralyzed, stuck between fury and despair. My body screamed at me to storm the terrace, to drag her back to reality and demand answers in front of the entire resort. But my mind told me to wait, to watch, to calculate. Then he stood, extending his hand to her. She took it without hesitation, her smile as radiant as ever. Together, they walked toward the dock, heading for a massive yacht gleaming in the distance. That was when my anger solidified into resolve. I waited until their backs were turned before restarting the engine, keeping my boat far enough behind to avoid detection. The low hum of the motor blended with the rhythm of the waves, masking my pursuit. The closer I got, the more surreal it all felt. The woman I thought I knew, the woman I'd built a life with, was walking hand in hand with another man. Her laughter floated back to me on the salty breeze, each note cutting like broken glass. The yacht loomed larger now, its name painted in elegant cursive on the stern, Aurora. Its deck was a stage for opulence. Plush seating, a shimmering pool, champagne chilling in ice buckets. It was the kind of place where secrets thrived in the comfort of luxury. Not today. I watched as they boarded, her lover placing a hand on the small of her back, guiding her up the gangplank. My hands trembled with a mix of rage and adrenaline as I killed the engine and let the skiff drift closer, silent as a predator stalking its prey. When they disappeared inside, I seized my chance. Climbing aboard felt like stepping into enemy territory. The polished wood gleamed underfoot, too perfect, too pristine. Every cautious step felt like an intrusion, a betrayal of its own, but I couldn't stop. Not now. Then I heard their voices, muffled but unmistakable, coming from a glass-paneled lounge near the rear of the ship. Are you sure he doesn't suspect anything? The man asked, his tone smooth, confident. Not a chance, Sarah replied with a laugh, her voice light and amused. He's too trusting for his own good. Her words struck like a sledgehammer, each syllable shattering whatever pieces of trust one had left. Too trusting. Was that who I was? The man she described felt like a stranger. I crouched near the edge of the glass, peering inside. They stood close, the man pouring her a glass of champagne as she leaned into him, her smile soft and radiant. Their intimacy ignited something primal in me, a rage so consuming it burned away the pain. But I didn't move. Not yet. I wasn't just here to confront them. I was here to destroy the lies, to expose everything they thought they'd hidden away on this floating sanctuary. Then, a shadow shifted behind me. I turned, startled, and locked eyes with a member of the yacht's crew. His expression froze, a mix of confusion and alarm, and my heart sank. For a moment, we both stood motionless, locked in a silent standoff. Then he opened his mouth to speak. Wait, I hissed, raising a hand. Too late. From inside the lounge, Sarah's voice rang out, sharp and alert. Did you hear that? The time for waiting was over. It was time to act. The sound of Sarah's voice from the lounge sent a jolt through me, but I forced myself to stay calm. My mind was racing, half panicked, half enraged, as I crouched lower against the smooth, polished railing of the yacht's deck. The crew member who had spotted me was still frozen, his eyes darting between me and the glass doors where Sarah and her lover were chatting. His face was a mix of confusion and fear, the unspoken question clear. Who are you, and what are you doing here? Please, I whispered urgently, raising a hand in a gesture of surrender. I just need 5 minutes. No one else has to know. For a long, agonizing second, he hesitated. His jaw tightened as he weighed his options, his gaze flicking to the lounge. Then, with a curt nod, he backed away, disappearing into the shadows of the lower deck. Relief washed over me, but it was fleeting. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The man's silent betrayal, his decision to let me stay unseen, only solidified my resolve. I couldn't leave yet. Not until I had something irrefutable. Words alone wouldn't cut it. Sarah could lie her way out of any confrontation unless I had proof. Scanning the area quickly, my gaze landed on a service tray near the lounge door. An empty champagne bottle gleamed beside a forgotten phone, its screen dark. It wasn't theirs. It likely belonged to the crew. But the temptation gnawed at me. Could it hold security footage? A guest log? Without a second thought, I grabbed the phone, tucking it into my pocket. My heart pounded as I stepped back into the shadows, the soft hum of the yacht's engines masking my footsteps. I needed leverage. The lower deck was dimly lit, its corridors a maze of sleek wood panels and brushed steel. I crept through them, my pulse hammering as I opened door after door. Most led to cabins or storage rooms, sterile and unremarkable. At the end of the hallway, I found what I was looking for, the captain's quarters. Slipping inside, I scanned the room quickly. The desk was neat, but a stack of papers caught my eye. Guest manifests, fuel receipts, route logs. Beneath them, a folder labeled Aurora Charter Details gleamed like a beacon. I flipped it open, my hands shaking. Inside were records of private bookings, including dates, names, and payment methods. When I saw Sarah's name next to multiple charges, my vision blurred with fury. She'd been paying for these weekends using our money, pulling cash from joint accounts under the guise of work expenses. But it was the name paired with hers that made my stomach drop. Dominic Verano. The name didn't ring a bell, but his occupation, wealthy investor with ties to multiple resorts and luxury businesses, told me everything I needed to know. He wasn't just some fling. He was someone who could offer her the kind of lifestyle she apparently thought I couldn't. The depth of her betrayal was staggering. She wasn't just cheating on me. She was building a fantasy life with someone else entirely, and I'd been footing the bill. I slammed the folder shut, the sound reverberating like a gunshot in the small room. My hands trembled with the urge to destroy something, to rip the papers to shreds, to hurl the elegant lamp on the desk across the room. But I knew better. This wasn't the time for rage. Not yet. As I paced the room, my thoughts spiraled. How long had this been going on? Months? Years? Had every business trip been a rendezvous? Every kiss goodbye? Every whispered I love you? Had any of it been real? For a moment, I wavered. The weight of it all threatened to crush me. A tidal wave of heartbreak and humiliation. Flashes of our wedding day, the promises we made, the life we built together. It all felt like a cruel joke. And then I heard her voice again, faint but audible through the walls. "Dominic, we need to be careful," she said, her tone low and conspiratorial. "If he finds out, it'll ruin everything." Her words reignited the fire in me. Ruin everything? Everything was already ruined. She'd done that the moment she decided I wasn't enough. Clenching my fists, I forced myself to breathe. This wasn't just about catching her anymore. It wasn't about proof or even confrontation. This was about reclaiming my dignity, my life. I tucked the folder under my arm and slipped out of the room, my mind already racing with possibilities. The phone in my pocket might hold incriminating messages or security footage. The charter details were damning enough on their own. And then there was Dominic, his wealth, his arrogance. He'd need to pay too. As I crept back up to the main deck, a new plan began to take shape. I wasn't going to let them slink away into the sunset, unscathed and unchallenged. By the time I reached the top of the stairs, I was brimming with cold, calculated fury. And that was when I saw her. Sarah stood on the upper deck, silhouetted against the deepening twilight. Her laughter carried on the breeze, light and carefree. She held a glass of champagne, her hand resting on Dominic's arm. They hadn't noticed me yet. I stepped forward, into the light, my voice calm but deadly. "Enjoying the view?" Sarah turned, her smile fading instantly as her eyes locked on mine. For a moment, there was nothing but silence, the weight of my presence crashing into her like a tidal wave. And then, the glass slipped from her hand, shattering on the deck at her feet. "Mark," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the roar of the waves. The confrontation had begun. Sarah's gasp hung in the air, a fragile sound that shattered the careful illusion she'd built. Her wide eyes darted between me and Dominic, searching for some kind of explanation, some escape. But there was none. "Mark," she stammered, her voice trembling, "what are you doing here?" "Funny," I said, my tone sharp enough to cut glass. "I was about to ask you the same thing." She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Instead, she glanced toward Dominic, who was watching me with a calm arrogance that made my blood boil. "Do you want to explain this, or should I?" I asked, crossing my arms as I took a slow step forward. The tension was electric, the crashing waves below a distant hum compared to the storm raging inside me. Sarah's face crumpled, her lips trembling as she finally spoke. "Mark, this isn't what you think." It wasn't even creative. The cliched denial only fueled my anger. I let out a bitter laugh, the sound foreign even to my own ears. "Oh, no? You're standing on a yacht with another man, laughing like I don't exist, and you want to tell me this isn't what it looks like?" Dominic stepped forward then, his presence infuriatingly calm. "Maybe we should all take a breath," he said, his voice smooth, calculated. "This doesn't have to be a scene." I rounded on him, my fists clenched. "Stay out of this. You've done enough." But Sarah reached out, grabbing my arm. "Mark, please. Let me explain." Her voice cracked, and for a moment, I saw a flicker of something real. Guilt, maybe even regret. My anger faltered, just slightly. I wanted to believe her, wanted to cling to the idea that there was still something salvageable between us. But the texts, the yacht, the private island, they told a story that no words could undo. "Go ahead," I said coldly, pulling my arm away. "Explain." She hesitated, her eyes darting to Dominic, then back to me. And then, with a shaky breath, she began. "It's complicated," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Complicated?" I snapped, stepping closer. "Try me." For the first time, I saw her composure crack entirely. I didn't plan for this to happen, okay? It just did. Dominic and I, she stopped herself, visibly grappling with her next words. Dominic's voice cut in, smooth and unapologetic. Sarah deserves more than you've been giving her. The words hit like a slap, and my gaze snapped to him. What the hell do you know about what she deserves? He smirked, a flicker of superiority in his eyes. Enough to know that she's been unhappy for a long time. I turned back to Sarah, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Is that true? You're unhappy? Her silence was deafening. And then, with a small nod, she said, I didn't mean for you to find out like this. The betrayal settled deeper, its weight suffocating. But as the words sank in, another realization began to form. This wasn't just about infidelity. There was something else. Something they weren't saying. Why him? I asked, my voice cutting through the tension. Sarah glanced at Dominic again, and in that fleeting exchange, I saw it. Fear. The pieces clicked into place like a cruel puzzle. Dominic wasn't just her lover. He was a ticket to something. Money, power, freedom. And she wasn't just betraying me. She was entangling herself in a life that had no room for the truth. I looked at her, really looked at her. For years, I'd loved her fiercely, blindly, without question. But standing here, under the weight of her lies, I saw someone I didn't recognize. You've made your choice, I said finally, my voice hollow. But you don't get to walk away without consequences. Dominic laughed softly, a low, condescending sound. What are you going to do? Throw a tantrum? I ignored him, my gaze locked on Sarah. You're going to regret this, I said, my words steady and deliberate. Both of you. Her eyes widened, but before she could respond, I turned and walked toward the edge of the deck. The crew member who had let me board earlier stood there, his expression unreadable. Without a word, I handed him the folder I'd taken from the captain's quarters. Hold on to this, I said quietly. He nodded, slipping it into his jacket, and I stepped onto the gangplank. As I descended, the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in bruised shades of orange and purple. The air was thick with the scent of salt and betrayal, and my mind was already racing. This wasn't over. They thought they'd won, that they could cheat, lie, and walk away unscathed. But they were wrong. The storm I felt inside wasn't just anger. It was purpose. Whatever came next, I would make sure they both felt the weight of what they'd done, and I wouldn't stop until they did. The ride back to the mainland felt longer than it should have, every wave lapping against the skiff a metronome to my spiraling thoughts. The sun had fully set by the time I reached the marina, but the darkness brought no relief. If anything, it made everything sharper, the cold air biting at my skin, the hum of distant boat engines, the low murmur of voices from the dock. Sarah's words echoed in my mind, relentless and taunting. Mark, this isn't what you think. She looked at me like a stranger, her face twisted with something between fear and pity. Was I really that blind? How many times had I dismissed the small lies, the moments of distance, because I didn't want to see what was right in front of me? A part of me still wanted to believe there was a shred of honesty in her, that this was all a misunderstanding, a phase, a mistake she regretted. But the other part, the part that had watched her laugh with him, drink with him, touch him, knew better. The anger came in waves, hot and suffocating. But underneath it was something deeper, more insidious, doubt. Not just in her, but in myself. Had I failed her somehow? Was I not enough? The thought burned, but it lingered, refusing to leave. I parked my car outside the house, sitting in the darkness for what felt like hours. The silence inside was deafening when I finally stepped through the door, her absence a reminder of everything that had unraveled in a single day. I wandered into the bedroom, every step heavy with exhaustion, and sat on the edge of the bed. Her scent lingered on the pillows, faint but unmistakable. It hit me like a punch to the chest, and before I could stop myself, I reached for the drawer in her nightstand. I wasn't sure what I was looking for. Answers, closure, anything to make sense of the chaos. But what I found wasn't what I expected. Tucked beneath a stack of books was a small leather journal I'd never seen before. I flipped it open, my fingers trembling, and was immediately met with her neat, deliberate handwriting. The entries were scattered, dated over the past year. Most were innocuous enough at first. Notes about work, friends, the occasional vent about stress. But as I read further, the tone shifted. Mark doesn't see it. He doesn't understand how lonely I feel, how suffocating it is to always be the one holding us together. Dominic says he sees me. He listens. He makes me feel like I matter. The pages blurred as I scanned entry after entry, each word slicing deeper than the last. She'd been unhappy for a long time, longer than I realized. And instead of telling me, instead of trying to fix what was broken, she'd chosen him. But then, buried near the back, I found something that stopped me cold. I can't keep this up. The lies, the sneaking around. It's eating me alive. Mark deserves better. But Dominic. The rest of the sentence was scribbled out, but the implication was clear. She was torn, caught between two lives. I sat there, clutching the journal, my mind racing. The betrayal was real, but so was the pain in her words. It didn't excuse what she'd done, not even close, but it forced me to see the cracks in our marriage weren't as one-sided as I'd let myself believe. For the first time since I'd followed her GPS to the marina, the anger began to ebb. It didn't disappear. I wasn't ready to forgive, not yet, but it gave way to something else. Clarity. She wasn't just the villain in this story, and I wasn't just the victim. We were both complicit in the slow unraveling of our marriage, even if her betrayal was the final blow. I stared at the journal for a long time before closing it and tucking it back where I'd found it. By the time I left the bedroom, a plan was forming in my mind. Not one born of revenge or blind rage, but of purpose. If she wanted to build a life with Dominic, she could, but not at my expense. Not without consequences. I pulled out my phone and dialed a lawyer's number I'd saved earlier that evening. The call went to voicemail, but I didn't mind. I left a message, my voice steady and calm. "Hi, this is Mark. I'd like to schedule an appointment to discuss divorce proceedings. Call me back when you can." Hanging up, I set the phone down and looked around the empty house. It felt different now, like a space I was seeing clearly for the first time. I wasn't sure what came next, but I knew this much. I wasn't going to let her, or anyone, define my worth again. For the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of control, a sliver of hope. It wasn't the ending I'd wanted, but maybe it was the beginning I needed. The door slammed harder than I intended when Sarah walked in that evening, her startled expression quickly masked by a carefully neutral facade. She placed her bag on the counter and took a slow, deliberate breath. "You're home early," she said, her voice trying for casual but landing somewhere near brittle. I stepped out of the shadows of the living room, arms crossed. Figured I'd stick around. Thought we might talk. Her eyes flickered. Fear, guilt, something unnameable. And then she plastered on that infuriating smile. The one she used when trying to smooth over a mess without admitting it existed. About what? "Don't do that." My voice was low, steady, but each word cut like a blade. "Don't stand there and act like you don't know what I'm talking about." Her smile faltered. "Mark, if you're upset about something, just say it." This tone isn't helping. I laughed bitterly, shaking my head. Tone? You think the problem here is my tone? I stepped closer, my fists clenching at my sides. The problem is that while you were supposedly networking, I was watching you cozy up to Dominic on his yacht. Her eyes widened for a fraction of a second, just long enough to confirm everything. But instead of falling apart, she surprised me. Her expression hardened, her voice lowering to match mine. "You followed me? That's what you're worried about?" I shot back, incredulous. "Not the fact that you're lying to my face? Not the fact that you've been cheating on me?" She didn't deny it. "Instead," she sighed, running a hand through her hair, "I should have known you'd do something like this." "Do something like what?" I snapped. "Catch you in the act?" "No," she said, her tone icy now. "Spiral. Make everything about you, like always." Her deflection hit harder than I expected, knocking me off balance for a moment. She saw it and pressed forward. "Do you ever stop to think why this happened?" she demanded, her voice rising. "Do you ever ask yourself why I've been unhappy for years? Why I felt like I had to find. She stopped herself, her lips pressing into a thin line. Say it, I growled, stepping closer. Go ahead. Finish that sentence. She crossed her arms, her gaze steady but full of something I couldn't quite place. Shame, maybe, or defiance. Why I felt like I had to find someone who actually listens, who actually sees me. The words hung in the air, sharp and heavy. My chest tightened, a mix of fury and disbelief coursing through me. So this is my fault now? You cheat, and somehow I'm the villain? No, Mark, she said quietly, her voice suddenly soft. You're not a villain, but neither am I. For a moment, the room was silent except for the ticking of the clock on the wall. I was about to respond when my phone buzzed on the counter. I grabbed it reflexively, grateful for the interruption. It was a message from an unknown number. If you want the full story about Dominic and Sarah, meet me at Harbor Cafe. Tomorrow, 10 a.m. My grip on the phone tightened as I reread the message, my pulse quickening. Who the hell was this? And how did they know about Dominic and Sarah? Who's that? Sarah asked, her voice laced with suspicion. None of your business, I snapped, sliding the phone into my pocket. Her jaw tightened, but she didn't push. Instead, she turned away, heading for the bedroom. I stood there, staring at the spot where she'd been, my thoughts racing. The tension in the room still hung thick, but now there was something else. Curiosity, unease, the undeniable pull of the unknown. Whoever had sent that message knew something I didn't. And if there was one thing I'd learned, it was that I couldn't trust Sarah to give me the full story. I walked to the kitchen, grabbed a glass of water, and stared out the window into the night. The city lights shimmered in the distance, a stark contrast to the darkness inside me. Whatever this was, it wasn't just about an affair anymore. It was bigger, Messier, and if I wanted answers, I'd have to go after them myself. Tomorrow, Harbor Cafe. I didn't know what I'd find there, but one thing was certain. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The clock read 9:42 a.m., but I'd been parked outside the Harbor Cafe for over an hour, the engine off, the silence in the car stretching thin. The message on my phone felt heavier than it should have, its words carved into my thoughts. If you want the full story, what else could there possibly be to know? Sarah had lied, cheated, and gutted our marriage piece by piece with every secret she kept. Yet, here I was, outside a cheerful cafe, the warm smell of coffee and pastries wafting through the air, feeling like I was on the edge of uncovering something far worse. The cafe's awning flapped lazily in the breeze, its bright colors clashing against the storm raging inside me. Couples sipped coffee on the patio, their laughter carrying across the street like a taunt. Once, that was us. Easy mornings, plans for the future, shared glances that didn't need words. Not anymore. The realization hit hard, a weight in my chest that refused to dissipate. I couldn't let this continue. Not the doubt, not the half-truths. If I wanted to rebuild my life, I needed the whole truth. Every ugly, unfiltered detail. At 9:50, I stepped out of the car. The cafe's hum of conversation and clinking dishes felt surreal, too bright and vibrant for the darkness I carried with me. My pulse quickened as I scanned the room. At first, I thought no one was waiting for me, but then I saw him. A wiry man in his mid-30s, his sharp, angular face partially obscured by the shadows in the corner. He wasn't drinking or eating, just tapping his fingers against the table in an erratic rhythm. His eyes met mine as I approached. Dark, watchful, calculating. "Mark?" he asked, his voice low and conspiratorial. "That depends," I said, my tone cautious. "Who are you?" He gestured to the chair across from him. "Sit. I think you'll want to hear this." Every instinct screamed at me to walk away, but the same instincts had failed me before. I sat down, crossing my arms, my gaze locked on his. "Start talking," I said. He leaned forward, his voice dropping even lower. "I work for Dominic Verano. Or at least I did, until I saw too much." "Too much?" I echoed, my skepticism sharp. His humorless smirk didn't reach his eyes. "Dominic's not just some rich investor. He's connected. And I don't mean in the networking sense. The kind of connected that gets people hurt when they become inconvenient. I stiffened, leaning closer. What does this have to do with Sarah? Everything, he said simply. She's not just some fling. She's leverage. Dominic uses people, draws them in, traps them, makes them think they're helping him. Your wife? She's in deeper than you realize. The words felt like a foreign language, incomprehensible and too heavy to process. Why should I believe you? I asked, my voice tight. For all I know, you're just trying to mess with me. He sighed, reaching into his jacket. I figured you'd say that. He slid a small envelope across the table. I hesitated, my eyes darting between him and the envelope, before I finally picked it up. Pulling out the contents, I immediately wished I hadn't. The first photo was bad. Sarah sitting across from a man I didn't recognize, her face lit by the glow of a desk lamp. Papers were spread between them, her posture tense but focused. The second photo was worse. Sarah's hand extended, passing what looked like a USB drive to the same man. In the background, Dominic stood with his arms crossed, his expression unreadable but commanding. The third photo was the one that left my stomach in knots. Sarah and Dominic together, their heads close as they examined a stack of documents. The intimacy between them was unmistakable, but it wasn't romantic. It was business. Dangerous business. What the hell is this? I demanded, my voice rising as I shoved the photos back into the envelope. Dominic's been using her to pass information, he said bluntly. Corporate secrets, financial data, stuff that's worth more than you'd think. She probably thought she was just helping him close deals. But trust me, Mark, she's in way over her head. I stared at him, my mind spinning. This wasn't just an affair. This was something far darker, far more dangerous. And you're telling me this why? I asked, my voice trembling despite my effort to stay composed. The man leaned back, his face grim. Because I know what happens to people Dominic uses. When they're no longer useful, they disappear. And Sarah? She's getting close to that line. The air felt thick and suffocating as his words sank in. You need to get her out, he continued, his tone urgent. Or at least get yourself clear before this pulls you under, too. I stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. The other patrons glanced over, but I didn't care. My mind was racing, my heart pounding. As I walked toward the door, his voice followed me. Be careful, Mark. You're playing with fire now. The sunlight hit me hard, a jarring contrast to the weight of the envelope in my hand. I leaned against my car, staring at the photos again, the implications swirling in my mind like a storm. Sarah might have chosen this path, but I couldn't let her drag me down with her. I climbed into the driver's seat, gripping the steering wheel tightly. The photos rested on the passenger seat, their presence both accusing and galvanizing. If Sarah had entangled herself in Dominic's world, I'd have to pull her out, or make damn sure I wasn't caught in the fallout. Whatever came next, I wasn't walking away quietly. The photos lay scattered across the dining table, illuminated by the harsh glow of the overhead light. I stared at them for what felt like hours, each image digging deeper into my mind. Sarah, with Dominic. Sarah, handing over the USB. The cold calculation on Dominic's face. This wasn't just infidelity anymore. It was betrayal on a level I hadn't imagined, dangerous, deliberate, and far-reaching. But the worst part? I didn't know if she was fully aware of what she'd stepped into, or if she'd been a willing participant all along. The doubt gnawed at me. A part of me still wanted to believe she was naive, that she didn't understand what Dominic was using her for. But another part, the part that had been burned too many times, wasn't so sure. I clenched my fists, forcing myself to breathe. It didn't matter if she was in over her head or in on the plan. Either way, she lied to me, betrayed me, and put us both in danger. I needed answers. I grabbed the photos, stuffed them back into the envelope, and headed for the bedroom. Sarah was sitting on the edge of the bed, scrolling through her phone when I walked in. She looked up, startled by the intensity in my expression. Mark, she asked, her voice cautious. What's wrong? I didn't answer. Instead, I tossed the envelope onto the bed beside her. What's this? She asked, her brow furrowing as she picked it up. Take a look, I said, crossing my arms and standing over her. Her fingers trembled slightly as she opened the envelope. When she saw the photos, her face went pale. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. Care to explain? I asked, my voice tight, barely controlled. She swallowed hard, her eyes darting between the photos and me. Where did you get these? That doesn't matter, I snapped. What matters is that you're going to tell me exactly what the hell you've been doing with Dominic. She shook her head, her voice rising. It's not what you think. Stop, I interrupted, slamming my hand against the dresser. She flinched, and the sound echoed in the room. You don't get to play innocent anymore, Sarah. Not after this. Her eyes filled with tears, but I wasn't sure if they were from fear, guilt, or anger. It's complicated, she whispered. Make it simple, I demanded. She hesitated, glancing at the photos again. Dominic. He asked me to do some things for him. Pass along files, set up meetings. I thought it was harmless at first, just helping him with his business deals. But then, she trailed off, her hands shaking. But then what? I pressed. Her voice dropped to a whisper. I didn't realize how deep it went until it was too late. He doesn't just do business, Mark. He controls people. He has leverage over them. Over me. Her words hit me like a sledgehammer. For a moment, I couldn't speak, the weight of what she was saying sinking in. You're telling me you got involved with someone like that? That you let him use you? My voice cracked, a mix of disbelief and fury. I didn't have a choice, she said, tears streaming down her face now. He threatened me, Mark. He said if I didn't help him, he'd ruin my career. And then he started saying he could ruin you too. Me. I stepped back, my stomach churning. She nodded, her voice trembling. He knows everything about us. Our finances, your job. He said he could destroy both of us if I didn't cooperate. I stared at her, my mind reeling. Part of me wanted to believe her, to see her as a victim caught in a web she couldn't escape. But another part, the part that had seen her laugh with Dominic on the yacht, completely at ease, wasn't so sure. Why didn't you tell me? I asked, my voice breaking. She looked down, her shoulders shaking. I was scared. I thought I could fix it on my own. I thought if I just kept him happy, he'd leave us alone. The room was silent except for her quiet sobs. I felt like the ground beneath me had shifted, like the rules of the game had changed without warning. Dominic wasn't just a lover. He was a threat, a powerful, calculating man who had his hooks in Sarah and, by extension, me. But I wasn't going to let him win. I turned and walked out of the room, ignoring Sarah's pleas for me to come back. In the living room, I grabbed my phone and scrolled to the lawyer's number, my hand trembling as I dialed. Mr. Carter, I said when the line clicked. I need to meet with you as soon as possible. Things have gotten more complicated. I hung up and stared at the darkened window, my reflection staring back at me. This wasn't just about uncovering the truth anymore. It was about taking control. If Dominic thought he could use Sarah against me, he was about to learn how wrong he was. The game had changed, and I was done playing by their rules. I stood in the empty living room, the envelope of photos on the coffee table like a relic from another life. The air felt different now, lighter somehow, though the weight inside me hadn't entirely lifted. For days, I'd been consumed by anger, betrayal, and the desperate need for answers. But now, staring at the space where Sarah and I had built a life together, I realized something I hadn't allowed myself to before. It wasn't just about her. Yes, she had lied, cheated, and dragged me into a mess I never asked for. But the cracks in our marriage, the distance that had grown between us, that had been years in the making. I wasn't innocent in that, even if I hadn't deserved what she did. I had spent so long holding onto the idea of us, of the life we were supposed to have, that I hadn't noticed it slipping away. Now, with the truth laid bare, I saw it for what it was, a lesson. Painful, cruel, but necessary. I wasn't the same man I was before all this, and I wouldn't let this define me any longer. Sarah came home just after sunset, her steps tentative as she entered the house. She froze when she saw me standing by the window, my suitcase by the door. Mark, she said softly, her voice heavy with something I couldn't quite name. Regret, maybe, or resignation. What's going on? I turned to face her, my heart steady for the first time in weeks. "I'm leaving," I said simply. Her face crumpled, the tears starting almost instantly. "Mark, please," she said, rushing toward me. "We can fix this. I'll fix this. I swear." "No," I interrupted, my voice firm but calm. "We can't fix this, Sarah. You made your choice and I made mine. This isn't about revenge or anger or even Dominic. This is about me. I can't stay in something that's broken beyond repair." She sank onto the couch, burying her face in her hands. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen," she sobbed. I got so lost, Mark." I knelt in front of her, the proximity startling even to me. For the first time, I felt something close to pity, not for what she did, but for the person she had become. "I know," I said quietly, "but this isn't about saving you anymore. It's about saving myself." Her sobs grew quieter, her breathing shallow. She looked at me, her face streaked with tears. "What do I do now?" "You figure it out," I said, standing. "You face what you've done, and you deal with it. But you do it without me." The last words felt heavy as they left my lips, but they also felt right. I grabbed my suitcase and headed for the door, the weight of the past lifting with every step. As I reached the threshold, Sarah called out one last time, "Mark." I turned, the cool evening air washing over me as I met her gaze. "I loved you," she said, her voice breaking. I nodded slowly. "I loved you too. But love isn't enough when the trust is gone." The door clicked shut behind me, the sound final and absolute. I stood on the porch, staring out at the street bathed in the golden glow of streetlights. For the first time in what felt like forever, I took a deep breath and felt my chest expand fully, unburdened. Sliding into my car, I glanced at the envelope of photos on the passenger seat one last time. The evidence, the pain, the betrayal, it had all brought me here, but it no longer defined me. As I drove away, the road ahead felt open, endless. I didn't know exactly where I was going, but I knew one thing for certain. It was forward. And that was enough. The air smelled like salt and earth, the breeze carrying the soft murmur of waves lapping against the shore. I stood on the edge of the cliffs just outside the city, the same place I used to come when life felt overwhelming. Back then, it had always been about finding peace, grounding myself in the vastness of the world. Now, it was about something else entirely. I looked down at my hands, the worn leather of the envelope clutched tightly between my fingers. The photos inside no longer had the same power over me. They were artifacts now, remnants of a life that felt distant and unreal. It wasn't just the betrayal I was leaving behind. It was the version of myself that had ignored the warning signs, the one who had clung too tightly to a relationship that had been slipping through my fingers for years. I let the memories wash over me. Our wedding day, the laughter, the promises. They were still there, sharp and vivid, but they didn't sting the way they used to. They were just pieces of the past, no longer the weights they had been. For the first time, I realized I wasn't carrying the same anger anymore. It wasn't forgiveness, not for Sarah, and definitely not for Dominic. But it was something close to understanding. I had been broken, yes, but I had survived. I opened the envelope, letting the photos slide out into my palm. One by one, I looked at them again, the images no longer searing into me the way they once had. They felt foreign now, like glimpses of a life that belonged to someone else. Taking a deep breath, I crouched and placed the photos on a flat rock at the cliff's edge. From my pocket, I pulled a matchbook, the kind I used to collect when Sarah and I traveled. I struck a match, the flame flickering defiantly against the wind, and touched it to the corner of the top photo. The fire spread quickly, consuming the glossy prints in a burst of orange and black. I watched as the flames turned them to ash, the edges curling and disintegrating, until there was nothing left but charred remnants that the wind carried away. It wasn't about revenge or erasure. It was about release. As the last embers drifted into the ocean air, I stood and looked out at the horizon. The sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of amber and rose, the colors bleeding into the water below. It felt symbolic, like the universe was trying to tell me something. I pulled out my phone, hesitating for just a moment before dialing the number I'd been thinking about all day. Mark. The voice on the other end was warm, familiar. My brother's. We hadn't talked in months, not really. He'd called during the worst of it, but I'd always brushed him off, too embarrassed to face anyone. Hey, I said, my voice steady. I was wondering if you're still up for that road trip you mentioned a while back. There was a pause, and then he laughed. Finally decided to take me up on it, huh? You know I'm always in. Good, I said, smiling for the first time in what felt like ages. Let's do it. I need to get out of here for a while. The conversation was short, but when I hung up, the sense of relief was immediate. I walked back to my car, the ocean breeze at my back, and tossed my phone onto the passenger seat. The empty space where the envelope had been caught my eye, but it didn't feel hollow anymore. Sliding into the driver's seat, I started the engine and let it hum beneath me. As I pulled onto the open road, I felt a strange, unfamiliar sensation blooming in my chest. It wasn't happiness, not yet, but it was hope. For the first time in a long time, the future didn't feel like something to fear. It felt like a blank canvas, waiting for me to decide what came next. The horizon stretched out before me, endless and alive, and I was ready to meet it.